Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I am joined by Nadine Amoros, author of Between the Lines, and her daughter Sophie Amoros, who translated the book. It's nice to see you again, Sophie and Nadine. A few years ago, we were able to meet in Paris, in Surin, actually near the American Cemetery in Surin, to talk about a book that you have written and translated called Between the Lines, which I'll just show up here. The story is about Nadine's grandfather, Charles, and Sophie's great-grandfather, who was a veteran of World War I. And the reason that I came into knowledge about this book is because I was looking for any information that I could find that was written about the German perspective of the Battle of Belleau Wood. And I discovered your book somehow. I actually don't know how I found it, but I'm so glad that I did. Charles was from Alsace-Lorraine, and he was conscripted into the German army during the First World War. And he struggled immensely with this because in his heart he was French. And it was very, very difficult for him to serve in the German army. And he kept a diary. He was posted to Laon, and during his time there fell in love with a woman named Isabel, and talked about this love in his diary, and then later was present at the Battle of Belleau Wood at the same time as the U.S., of course, was there, and during the month of June 1918. And his perspective is quite interesting during the experiences that he had while he was in this area. And so the book is about Nadine finding this manuscript that her grandfather had written and retracing the story of his relationship with Isabel and trying to find Isabel, and then also retracing his footsteps in the various places where he had been during the war. And it's a beautiful book. Charles was a beautiful person, and shared about the inner conflicts that he experienced as being a French person serving in the German army, as well as the very human interactions that he had with his commanding officer and then others that he served with. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more about the book and anything else that you would like to share about what it's been like as a descendant to retrace your grandfather and great-grandfather's footsteps. The book has also been published. This is an English copy, which Sophie has translated from French into English, and it's also available in German. And so hopefully everyone who hears this and watches this will go find the book, because it is a really beautiful account of a young soldier during the First World War. So, hello, bonjour, welcome, bienvenue. I would love to hear about who was your grandfather, and a bit about where he grew up and the context from which he approaches the First World War.
Hello, my name is Nadine. I'm the granddaughter of Charles, who was a soldier in the First World War, and I published his memoirs. We call the book Between the Lines.
So hello, my name is Sophie. Thank you so much, Heather, for having us. I'm here today as Charles' great-granddaughter, and also as sort of a spokesperson for my parents, and especially my mom, Nadine. So my parents worked on editing Charles' memoirs from his time during the war, and you described everything beautifully, Heather. And as my mother isn't totally comfortable speaking in English, I will be the one explaining most of our journey with this book. So Between the Lines, as you mentioned, it was published in French and in English as well. So a few words about Charles. He was born in 1898 in Lorraine, so in the east of France, a region that had been annexed by Germany in 1871 after the war. So legally he was German, but in his family everything remained very attached to France. the language. He spoke both French and German, and actually he says he speaks kind of broken French and a broken German. So there's this sort of, he's half, and he's not entirely French or entirely German. So that he still has strong ties with the language, with the culture, the relationships around him, because they lived very near the border to France. And actually, his sister got married with a Frenchman before the war. And and then the war breaks out. And in 1917, Charles is drafted into the German army. So he was only 19 at the time. And like many other young men from Alsace-Lorraine, he had no choice. He had to wear the German uniform, but he also did it, and he felt it was his duty to fight. So he had this sense of duty that he had to do it. But his heart was elsewhere. Because as you mentioned, he felt French at heart. So it creates a very sort of inner conflict, a very conflict identity that runs throughout the entire book. And maybe to say also who Charles was after the war, he came back to his home that was now part of France again, and he became a baker, a husband, a father, and then later the grandfather that my mom remembers. And she remembers him as a very warm man, a real family man. He loved having everyone together for Christmas, for birthdays. He loved singing. And my mom and her sister, they actually grew up in the same house as their grandparents. So Charles helped raise my mom, and he died when she was 12 in 1977. So he was a huge presence in her childhood. And what's striking, the way that she remembers him, is that he never really talked about the war. So it's not something that he shared with his family, but they knew at the time that he was writing something about his time during the war. And near the end of his life, when he became ill, he started losing his memory, and he became obsessed with the fear that war could return, and so that he had to get rid of evidence that he took part in the war. So he destroyed a lot of souvenirs, a lot of documents, including he tried destroying his manuscript. But what no one realized at the time is that my mom and her sister, they had actually rescued the manuscript, and they hid it somewhere in the house. So around the late 1970s. And then my mom rediscovered it by chance in 1993 at her mother's house. And so after that, she kept the pages for about 20 years still, with the idea of maybe doing something one day with it. And at first, she imagined it more as something to pass down within the family to future generations, because all of Charles' children are gone now, but he has many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, including myself. And then in 2018, so it was the centenary commemorations of the end of World War I, and my parents felt that the experience of soldiers like Charles still wasn't really being told. And it's true that in France, there is very little that is taught about the hundreds of thousands of men from Alsace-Lorraine who were forced to fight in the German army, with all the conflicts that it entailed for them in terms of identity. And then after the war, who became French again and had to kind of, struggle with the fact that they were on the German side before that. And so with this, idea that there was this voice missing, that's when the project really began, with the idea of sharing Charles' story.
It's amazing to think that a young person would see the manuscript, and Nadine, you and your sister, something prompted you to think that this must be important and it needed to be rescued. And I'm wondering if you can explain what that was. What prompted you to keep the manuscript? Because it was taken right from a trash bin, right, and brought out.
Yeah, they found it in the trash can. I think they knew that it was something important, and that he had been working on it for a while. And I think as children do, you find something and you think, okay, yeah, I hide it. But it's interesting that it took so many years for it to come back again. And
Yes.
yeah, and it felt like sort of a last message from him at the time. Mm.
Where was it hidden? Did it stay in the
Um,
same spot for 20 years?
can I ask her in French and then
Yes, yes,
you
sure,
can.
please.
Ça a été caché où, une fois que quand tu l'as caché quand tu étais petite?
En fait, on l'a juste mis dans un tiroir,
Mmh.
quand maman est restée longtemps,
Ah oui, c'est quand après elle est restée.
c'est quand elle a déménagé.
Mmh. So actually, they hid it in a drawer in the house because they lived with their grandparents and with their mother, and then after he passed away and then their grandmother passed away, they stayed in that house for at least their mother stayed in that house for a while until 1993, and it's only when my grandmother moved and they had to move the furniture and then they found
Wow.
the manuscript again. Yeah.
So the manuscript then is refound. The story is found in 1993, and then 2 more decades pass, uh, up to 2018, and your parents decide it's time to tell the story of Charles because it also sheds light on the stories of other soldiers during the First World War, particularly those French soldiers who served with the German army. What was it like then? What was that process to decide that the manuscript should be published so others could read about it? And walk me through from the time that it was just that the family decided to publish it to actually publication, what occurred during this period of time?
So maybe you want to say just.
At first, we only wanted to publish a Charles text, but then we wanted to learn more about Isabelle.
So yeah, at first my parents, they were only focusing on publishing Charles text. They realized that they had something that was a testimony that beyond being a personal story that they wanted to share with the family, it was a testimony that actually spoke to the experience of a lot of other young men that were in Charles' situation. So they, decided, okay, let's find a way to get it out there to publish it. And on that process, it already took about a year with editing the text because it was, it was just paper. And so they structured it in chapters. They fact checked all the historical aspects. They, did some editing to make it more, clear for the readers. And then they researched how to self-edit. So all of that was already quite a long process. And then there was the entire translation process that was also, it actually took place during COVID. So we were, we didn't have necessarily a lot of other things to do. So, okay,
Mhm.
so we dove into the translation. And then after the book came out, my parents, they went to Laon. It was a city that was such a big part of Charles' experience in the war. And they went for a book signing. And there they met people who were very moved by the story, including a local woman named Cecile, who encouraged them to continue researching Isabel because she was really interested in knowing then what happened to
Mhm.
her. And Cecile actually became a good friend to my parents. So they went looking for, proof of Isabel's life and trying to find, a thread of what happened to her after that. So they went in the city archives, which are in Laon, and they found the 1915 census. And there were only 4 women named Isabel among about 6,000 inhabitants. And one of them, so they went through sort of the details that were known about each of those women, and one of them matched Charles' story. And that's how they found her full name. And then with the help of genealogists and social media, they located her family, and they were able to meet one of Isabel's nephew, Gilbert. And it was actually almost exactly 100 years after Charles had last seen Isabel that they met Gilbert. So it was a very moving experience. They learned more about Isabel, about her life after the war, and they learned that kind of like Charles, she actually never talked about the war with her family. And having learned all of that and having kind of went through all that research, they edited a new version of the book that includes all of that research, their trips to Laon, and it sort of mirrors Charles' experience with their own experience, learning more about that time period.
It's such a beautiful account of a family's pilgrimage. On one hand, to discover the grandfather and great grandfather, but grandfather that Nadine knew, and then also to discover who Charles was as a young man through the eyes of his own testimony. And what was that like to rediscover or discover for the first time pieces of Charles's life and how he saw the world and people he loved at a time that predated the family history, so to speak, with Charles?
For me, the book completely changed the way I understood my grandfather. Before this book, I don't understand how deeply the war affected my grandfather. I knew him with the eyes of a little girl, and through this book, I discovered a young man who was the same age as my own son.
Yeah, I think it was interesting to kind of for my mother to kind of go through that at that time period. It was also after my grandmother, her mother, had passed away, so it was kind of retracing the step of the family history. And she mentioned that really finding when she found the writings in 1993, so he had already been gone for a few years, and it felt like he had left a final message. It was kind of finding sort of this treasure that had been hidden for all this time. That was sort of a lifeline to him. And then life took its course, and it took 25 years, and the fact that also self-publishing had become possible for us and for my parents to finally decide to find a way to publish the book. And as she said, as a child, she knew him as a loving grandfather, as this kind of patriarch, this big figure in her life. And through the book, she discovered a young man that was living through fear, through moral conflict, through uncertainty, and finding that first love, and that was so important to him at the time. So it's very touching, and it's the same for me. I never knew him, of course, but he left such a personal testimony in this book at the time where he was younger than I was when I first read the book. So it felt really touching to know him in this way, and to feel like I knew a part of his story that was not something that he shared with a lot of people at the time.
I wish all families could have such experiences. I think this points to the importance of documenting our lives so that our descendants can learn about who we are through our own words. The book you just mentioned, and also the book spends quite a lot of time in Laon during the time that Charles was there. What are some things that you learned about him, or about Isabel, or about the town um, through the writings of Charles when you visited?
We visited Laon for the first time in 2019. It was very emotional to be there. It felt like Laon hadn't changed much from Charles' time.
So my parents, they visited so a few years ago now for the first time Laon, and what they mentioned that really struck them is that it hadn't changed much. It felt like being in the book, because a lot of the main uh,
Yes.
structures in the book. So you have the cathedral, you have the cobblestone streets, the town hall that used to be the German Kommandantur, so the headquarters for the region, and even Isabel's house. It's all still there. So they mentioned that it felt surreal to walk where Charles had walked, to see the same sights, to walk the same streets. And they were also able to continue with the fact checking by going to Laon, because they met with the current bookstore owner, and he confirmed that it would have been possible for Charles to procure fake papers, because at a point in his story he had kind of this decision to make, whether he wants to use those fake papers and sort of avoid going back to the front line. And so the bookstore owner, he confirmed that it would have been possible to have those fake papers because the store at the time was a printing house, and they did print fake papers during nighttime. So he had this, this confirmation, and so it was, it was really fun to make those connections all this time, all these years later. And also the story really resonated a lot with the people of Laon. So that I think for them it was interesting to meet some of those people and to be able to share with them part of the history of their town, because Laon was really, it was the place of the Commandant, so he had a lot of this history still in the walls everywhere. And my parents, they were able to meet with the current mayor. They were able to have a ceremony there with him and some of the local officials to donate part of the book's proceeds to Le Souvenir Français, which is a non-profit organization which is dedicated to preserving the memory of soldiers who died for France and maintaining war memorials. So now they really have this link to Laon, which is, I think, really, emotional for them to be able to have done all of that.
I remember visiting. I've been to Laon several times, but one of the times was after I read the book a few years ago. And I remember actually being at a place in the town and looking down at the railroad tracks and thinking, because Charles talked about trains coming, and I remember thinking, oh, I wonder if he was in this spot looking down exactly where I am, because it is sort of out on this precipice. And I could just imagine your family being there and looking at what he had written and thinking about constructing this story around what he had written and being in the exact places. I mean, many families go to battlefields and they want to see exactly where their ancestor fought or where the ancestor died. And this is a little bit different because it's a reconstruction of daily life as a soldier, which I think humanizes the experience a bit more. That aspects of Charles's life were mundane, but coming back to them 100 years later uh, paints this really dynamic picture of what life would have been like for him during 1918.
It's true. It's a book about war and about love.
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, it's Between the Lines is a testimony of a young man who is conscripted into the German army. And so he feels conflicted about fighting. He feels conflicting about fighting on the German side, even though he's trying to do his duty. And it's about some of the battles that he went through, like Verdun and Belleau Wood, and the terrible things that he had to do and to witness. But as you mentioned, it's also about everyday life during the war, because during that year in the war, he's stationed at the German Kommandantur in Laon, where the German army had advanced. So he lived among French civilians who were under the German army rule. And because he speaks French, he is able to kind of be the translator and find ways to form connections on the other side of the front line. And so it's I think, as I mentioned, it's a really interesting testimony of what life was like in Laon and in probably many other cities like Laon at the time. And there's this very personal thread of his first love, Isabel, who he meets in Laon, and how this love is what helps him during the worst moments of his life, when he's in the trenches, when he's on the battlefield, going through terrible conditions. And the fact that they are both, struggling with this idea that she's a French woman, he's a German soldier at the time, and all the impossibilities that entails. So it's a war story, but it's a lot of what matters in the book is what's said quietly, the doubts, the moments of humanity, the longing for peace, and the longing for being able to go home. And so it's really what happens between the lines of this terrible war.
And it seems that his whole life he was in a bit of a liminal space, because he's French speaking in the German army. He's treated with suspicion from both sides. Even after the war, the soldiers that are returning into what is now France are treated with suspicion because they were on the side of the Germans. And so I do wonder how that impacted his identity throughout his whole life, where these early experiences as a young man being treated with suspicion, but also having this inner conflict of identifying in one way or another, how this may have impacted him into his adulthood and later life.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it must have been a really conflicting situation for him, and it's not, as I mentioned, it's not something that is really taught in school, so we don't really have those testimonies of how it was for all those soldiers to one day be on the German side and then the other day going back home and then knowing that it's not German anymore. And there's actually this passage in the book where they learn that the war is over and that they are going home, and all the soldiers from Alsace-Lorraine, they sing this song about going home. And they are all excited to go home, and they have this big sign to say, okay, so everyone who's going back to the east of France, it's this way. And so there's this joy in the book, but then when they come back, they are faced with French soldiers who are not sure how to treat them at first, and some of them, they don't necessarily speak French anymore. Not all of the Alsace-Lorraine soldiers spoke French. So he's once again in this situation of being sort of the interpreters of bridging this gap between two worlds. And it's not something that he delves too much into the book after that, because it ends with the end of the war, and then we have sort of the search for Isabel that concludes the book. But I think it helped to go home to Alsace-Lorraine, and where everyone had kind of had this similar experience. And in that way, Alsace and Lorraine, then you had the Second World War. It's deeply in the history of that region, this kind of struggle between two identities, and this feeling of being French and having been torn apart from France a few times, and being able to go back home. But they also have a lot of specificities just in terms of the legal framework and some stuff that they inherited from the time that they were within the German territory. So I think there's this particular identity in Alsace and Lorraine. And so I think it was probably easier to go back home with people that had lived the same experience. And he lived a quiet life after that. He was a baker. He had his family. He got married, and I think he made peace with that identity. I think it was easier because during the whole book, you can see he's truly a pacifist, and he has no hatred towards the German side nor towards the French side, and he just wants to go home. He just wants to go back to his family. So the war to him wasn't. It was something that was above him, that was decided by the states and the great powers that be, but he had no interest in seeing the end of the war besides being able to go home. So I think he made peace with that. But it would be interesting to learn more about kind of the difficulties that probably a lot of those men had, having to go back to that status quo that was different after.
I did get a very strong sense when reading the book that this is a young man who is caught up in terrible events. And I would like to think that this is how most soldiers felt, that they were trying to do their duty, but they were caught up in events that were not of their choosing, and they just wanted peace. I mean, Charles talked about this throughout the book, and I think that uh, many soldiers writing in their diaries talk about the same thing, which is that they envision a time when there will be peace and that people will be able to live with one another and not resort to violence to accomplish political goals.
Yeah. Charles' experience at Belleau Wood is one of the strongest parts of the book, and reflects that.
Yeah, I think the Belleau Wood chapters really shows how much those young soldiers, they were caught up in a situation that was horrific, and there was no way out but trying to survive, trying to see another day. And the way he describes the chapter is, so he arrives there in June 1918 when you can sense that the German side is starting to collapse. So he describes being moved at night, finding himself near Chateau Thierry, and then facing the French and the American troops. And what comes through all this part, I think, is really the chaos that was all around them. There are explosions everywhere, a lot of confusion, a sense that everything is falling apart. They get made prisoners, and then they they make other prisoners, because in the chaos, no one knows, which way to go, how to get out of this situation. And so it's not about heroism; it's about fear and exhaustion and wanting to survive and see another day and be able to go home at the end of the war. And so he describes the caves in Belleau Wood. He described that they were used as improvised infirmaries, how the wounded soldiers were crowded inside in the dark with very little air, how every morning the dead had to be removed. So it's a very gripping chapter. But I think one scene that really stayed with me, I think with any reader, is during the night watch when Charles is alone at the machine gun post and he sees a French soldier moving through the wheat field, and they see each other, and Charles has his finger on the trigger and he's sort of frozen because he can't bring himself to shoot. And you can see there's no hatred there. There's only fear on both sides. And so he watches the soldier and he lets him go. And I think that moment, it says a lot about Charles and how he felt during the war, how it's not about enemies or uniforms. I think that's what Belleau Wood represents in the book. It's about a young man who can't bring himself to kill another human being, who just wants peace and to be able to go home one day. And as you mentioned, it was probably the experience of most of these soldiers that were so young. And I think now it's hard to imagine how young those men were and how they were brought into these chaotic situations that were so terrible to witness, and you just had to try to find a way to to survive. And obviously they struggle with the idea that to do that you sometimes had to kill the young men that were on the other side. But I think that this part is a really beautiful chapter in the book.
It is, and it's the chapter that led me to the book and to you. And there are some interesting parts of the chapter. So we've already talked about what it was like for your family to be in Laon, in the exact places where Charles was. And I have taken the book with me to Belleau Wood and to the village of Belleau, because he talks about both in the chapter, to try and figure out where he was. And so he talks about the chateau, where there's the French regimental flag that is still flying. He talks about it being this act of resistance. And then he talks of, so I know exactly where this is, and all people who are familiar with Belleau Wood and Belleau know about the chateau, which is in the village of Belleau. And so I can definitely place this. When he talks about the caves, though, this is something interesting, and I'm still trying to explore exactly which caves he's talking about, because there were, of course, caves underneath the chateau where there's a field hospital there because there's a water source and there's protection. And so I initially thought this is what he was talking about, but he talks about leaving the chateau and then relocating to caves which are some distance away, which would not be under the chateau because it wouldn't be some distance. They would have just walked around to the base and or maybe a little bit up the woods, or up the road into the woods. There's an entrance there, but that's not very far away. So I'm curious if you have found exactly where these caves are that Charles writes about.
I'll just ask. So, elle parle de, tu sais, la grotte quand il dit qu'ils sont à Belleau Wood. Elle demande si Parce qu'elle a visité le château, elle demande si vous avez pu trouver, où c'était exactement.
Non, parce qu'en fait, on n'a plus le droit de visiter maintenant et Gilles
Mmh.
Lachin, lui, il avait pu le faire.
Mmh.
Il y a encore beaucoup de choses à l'intérieur des grottes.
Mais du coup, il a confirmé qu'il y avait des grottes.
Ah oui, il est rentré et il y a encore beaucoup, il y a des remparts, des voitures, des armes. Il y a encore beaucoup de choses à l'infirmerie.
Sorry, I'm just
Yes, we spoke with Gilles Lachin, with a guide at Belleau
Yes.
Wood, and he's a very passionate about
Yes.
that time period and confirmed that it exists.
So yeah, they were able to speak with him through actually connections that they made with the book, and they spoke with him on the phone. They weren't able to meet him because he mentioned that he's a guy, so he's able to, but in the past he was able to help families find the places where sometimes their family,
Mhm.
their ancestor died during the war.
Mhm.
And he did confirm that those caves existed and that you can find there are still, objects left in the caves, but it's not something that you can visit anymore. So he's not able to bring
Mm.
anybody else now, but he did confirm that he had seen it with his own eyes, and that there are still a lot of artifacts left there, and you can see the place where the infirmary was, and so yeah, it was
That's
interesting.
fascinating. Because Charles says they're the infamous caves of Belleau or infamous caves of Belleau Wood. So that's that is yeah, that's a new piece of this context that I'm really interested in. I also had a question, which you may not know the answer to, but I was wondering in the chapter about Bella Wood, in the order that it is presented, Charles references actions that happened on June 14th, and then he goes back to talk about the earlier June 1 through 6th. So he was there during this entire time period. And I wondered if, in his recollection as he's writing this in his later life, if he is also thinking about the fact that Bella Wood has become quite well known. And so the recollection then sort of centers around these events that happen on June 14th, and then he thinks, oh, there was this other really important time that I was also there, which was the beginning of June, because the chronology isn't exact in the chapter. So I was curious about if this is how he wrote this account was starting at the 14th and then goes back to the beginning, or if this was how you decided to publish that account.
Enfin, c'est pas dans l'ordre chronologique parce qu'après il revient en arrière, donc non, c'était comme ça dans ses écrits, c'est pas quand vous l'avez étudié.
Non, non, c'était comme ça, oui,
Mmh.
oui.
So it was actually written this way, and it's something that we discussed together, how, it's sort of out of order, and yeah, we think it's possible that it was, colored by the fact that this was a historical event, and so he tried
Yes.
to talk about this period. And you can see also in the beginning of the book, he has this sort of this historical approach and trying to, add, the historical aspect of this war to his personal story. So I think that's what we think it's what he was trying to do. And also, uh, we think, this chapter, it was probably written later, in the last part of the book that he wrote. So it's possible that by that time, he was starting to get ill. He was starting to lose his memory. So maybe it was harder to, make sure that his recollection were in perfect order. But yeah, you're right. There's this sort of discrepancy, and it's something that my parents try to, work through in the way they edited, and how much they fact checked everything,
Mhm.
and to their knowledge, everything that's in the book is accurate. but they also, tried sometimes to edit it in a way that made sense in the sequence of events, but also to leave, the essence of what was his recollection and his memories of that time.
It did make me smile to think that he possibly was writing about the recollection in Belleau Wood, and he starts on June 14th, and then he has this thought, "Oh, I was actually there when all of this other famous, these famous actions happened, and I have something to say about this also."
Yeah. And it's there's a lot of, I think you're true. I think there's some parts of the book where you can see sort of the way his thought process might have worked,
Yes.
and it's interesting also in this book the way that there's this distance between, the memories and the experience that he had as a young man and the way he sees it as an old man. And I think there's a lot of humor in it as well,
Yes.
even though it's, a very dark time period. But I like, all these little humorous touches in the book. It really
Yeah,
made
me
me smile
too.
as well. Mm.
What has it been like to share this with other families? What do people say to you about maybe their own family histories? Has it created a situation whereby people are interested to research their great uncles and great grandfathers and grandfathers? Uh, what kind of links have you experienced with other families?
It's been a very human experience. We met a lot of people thanks to the book.
Yeah, and the book created a lot of unexpected connections for my parents in France and abroad. As you mentioned, of course, when you talk about the book, there's a lot of people who say, "Oh, I have this in my family history as well, but I don't remember all the details because we don't have sort of this, this book of all the writings to really pass along the story." And so I think for a lot of people, it makes them, think of their own family history and how time passes, and sometimes you lose those part of your history. And but there was also a lot of connections. To people that were sort of on a similar journey. My parents, they met historians, they met readers, of course, they met writers, including, for example, Andrew Capets, who is an American, who is the author of Good War and Great Men, about American soldiers during the Great War. So he came to France when he wanted to visit American cemeteries, and we were able to connect with him. We spent the day with him, so that those connections were really touching for us. And actually, it's through Andrew that my parents were able to connect with Gilles Lajan, who is the guide at Belleau Wood. So there's been a lot of connection. They made friends through this process. There was also this German TV channel that became interested in the story, so they made a documentary about the research. The TV channel, the journalists, they came to Laon, they met with my parents, they filmed the city, they explained all the Charles story. So it was a really exciting experience, and it made a lot of connections possible. But more than anything, it felt like allowing Charles' voice and the voice of many others like him to be heard. So I think that's the most important part of the process.
Yes. Have you been able to track through sales of the book or through conversations that you're having, uh, are the sales increasing in each of the three languages? Is there one that is increasing more than others? And what are your thoughts about why that is?
So the French version is still the one that is selling the most, because I think there's this really personal connection to, it's a war that took place in France. And it's interesting because during certain time of the year, there's sort of an increase in sales around the anniversaries and that sort of things. And obviously, when we do some sort of promotion around the book, it's interesting to see that it's often resonates with people. And we do hope that the book can continue to travel and find new readers, especially in the United States, because as you mentioned, there's this this chapter around Belleau Wood
Yes.
that's intimately tied with American history and American soldiers in France. And we hope that the book can travel in places of memory and continue to help people understand war not just as history but as the lived experience of so many of those young men.
Mm. Is there a part of the book that you connect with more than other parts?
I can ask my mom if she has an answer, but I'll give you my answer as well. Je demande la partie du livre avec laquelle tu connectes le plus.
Bah, tout au début, je trouve quand il part à la guerre et qu'il a vraiment la vue de ce qu'est la guerre, en fait. Parce qu'en fait,
Mm.
c'est un jeune et il comprend
Mm.
pas et tout d'un coup, il voit les morts dans les
Mm.
barbelés et ça
Mm.
m'a vraiment, et quand il voit ses amis mourir tout de
Mm.
suite,
Mm.
c'est, la première image qu'il a de la guerre, en
Mm.
fait.
So actually, we kind of have the same, similar, view on that. Is that the first chapter of him really being in the trenches, really experiencing the war, and how he sees his friend die, and he's really confronted with this idea that war is a terrible thing, and that you have to fight to kind of. There's this sentence that I'm paraphrasing, but says that he has to try and compress the part of his soul that still exists in his body, because it's really hard to remain human and keep hope when you're faced with that situation. And there's part in the book, I think it's a bit. It's around the time when they start celebrating Christmas, and there's this ceasefire for the day, and he sees soldiers in the barbed wire that are stuck there for eternity because they are frozen in time. They've been shot there, and it's a really striking visual of what the battlefield looked like for him. And again, it's hard to realize that he was only still a teenager basically at the time. He was so young. He had only known his hometown, his family, and is faced with those horrors. And those chapters are really hard to read because I think he does a really good job of explaining how it felt. And it's interesting because he's not afraid of saying that he cried. And I think maybe at the time when he wrote those words, and even still now, I think sometimes for men it's not easy to admit that you are crying about something that's sad, and he's not afraid to say how much it was affecting him at the time, and how sad, how much despair he felt. So yeah, I think that those are really striking parts of the book. And also the scene, as I mentioned, the one where he's faced with that soldier, and you can see it's this intimate decision of there's nobody around, and but he has to make this quick decision because if anybody else sees him, then he's gonna have to shoot the soldier. So I think that's a really striking moment of the book as well. But I'm interested in knowing what's your the part that really struck with you.
I was also struck by the parts that you are describing. I very much when he sees the French soldier coming through the wheat field, I think there's this individual choice in that moment, and he discloses what his choice was. Some people may not. I mean, we are all faced with choices and small choices that may have very uh, large impact, and sometimes we don't reflect on what those choices were or are in the moment. And so I think that impacted me. I really appreciated the way he described the relationship he had with his commanding officer. I think that this was a unique relationship where many aspects were left unsaid, but there was a mutual understanding of who each of them were outside of the army, but then also in the army. And so I think the 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 aspect of the book that I appreciated the most, which is an overarching aspect, is that Charles focused on the relational dimensions that he had, these dynamics that developed with other soldiers, and of course with Isabel, and even with himself. He's quite insightful. He is a reflective person who is not only experiencing the moment, but also reflecting on what it means. And of course, he's writing this in later life when we do engage in that type of reflection a little bit more. But clearly, he was reflecting on it also in the moment because he remembered those reflections later when he was writing.
There's also another part of the book where he's being questioned by the Germans, and sort of they are questioning his loyalty to the German army because his brother kind of left and he's on the other side. And he describes very well how scared he was. And
Yes.
I think, as you mentioned, he's really reflective of, and he's really able to describe the emotions that he felt, and he's not, shy in explaining all of that. And once again, you realize he's only a child, and actually that's one of the officers that is there. The officer at the end says, "Okay, there's nothing to see there. They are only children, not soldiers." And I think this part is also, quite telling of how scary it must have been to be a
Mhm.
soldier in that time. And as you mentioned, all the relationships that he makes in Laon with Isabel, of course, with the professor as well, who's also a very insightful man about, how much this war is only, about something bigger than any of them. And there is a lot of tenderness in his relationship with Isabel. Obviously, a lot of things unsaid because at the time, you didn't disclose your emotion as
Yes.
much. She was a married woman. Her husband was somewhere at the front. She doesn't know if he's alive or dead, and they are both very young. And she's French. He's a German soldier, and there's this. All those time where they are alone together, and sort of a lot of silence between them because a lot of things have to remain unspoken.
Mhm.
Those moments are also very, very tender, very
Mm.
touching.
Yes. How did reading the manuscript and then translating it and writing for both of you, how did that change you?
Um, it's interesting. I think I learned a lot of things just, as a French person who is, a descendant of all of that history. I learned a lot about, the war and that situation for those soldiers. And of course, it's a part of my family history. It was really touching to read about him. As I mentioned, he was already younger than I was when I read the book. And I remember initially I wasn't necessarily too thrilled about reading the manuscript. I remember my parents when they started kind of rediscovering it, and I was a teenager myself, and I was I'm not sure I'm really interested in reading about World War One. And actually, I think it's and maybe I'm biased, but I think it's also really beautifully written. And I think he had this talent in writing and kind of making clear how it felt to be a soldier at the time and explaining his true feelings. And it's really touching because he was so young, and he was aspiring to something that was really simple. He just wanted to be able to love, to be able to make those connections without being afraid of how it was forbidden to be, talking to a French person when you're a German soldier. And he wanted to be able to go home. He wanted to be able to go to see his mother again. So all of that is really touching. And I think for us, it was also kind of this family project that was, a fun experience to go through together, to go through the editing process, go through the translating process. Of course, a lot of it is my parents being the motor of all of that, and trying to find ways to make Charles' story more heard. And yes, it's I think in a way you feel like you have this sort of responsibility to make sure that this stays a part of history and not
Mhm.
stays hidden in the drawer where it was a few years ago still. So yeah, I think it's a really touching thing to go through together as a family.
I think the book would be a wonderful audiobook as well. I don't know if you have intention to do this, but there's so much dialogue that occurs. I think it would be nice to hear the book in addition to reading the book.
Yeah, you're right. That's some things that we talk about, kind of like in our wish list, like the way we would want to continue to make sure that the book keeps living on.
Mhm.
And you're right. I think an audiobook could be really nice. We've talked about maybe doing it in a um, uh, like sort of drawings, so we could have the visual as well as the text.
Yeah.
And actually my father kind of bucket list is having it being made into a movie, so we're not
Well,
there yet.
I it would be a beautiful movie, actually. I think the whole story actually lends itself very well to being represented in film. So I could see this, and I could also imagine your father having this grand idea because he's quite enthusiastic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because also, this is my mother's grandfather, and she's really attached to history, and she's really happy to be doing all of this and allowing more people to learn about history. But also my father, who's not related to Charles at all, but really connected to history, and he's really enthusiastic about
Yes.
all of those projects and the way that we can talk about it. So yeah, he's really, in his wish list, he really thinks we can make it into a movie one day. So
I think he's
but
right. I think he's right, actually. I hope it will happen. Is there where can viewers and listeners find the book?
so it's on Amazon, and as the French version and the English version as well. And there's two. I think it's not the case in English, but in the French version, you have the initial, publication that was only Charles reading. Charles writing, and then there was this second edition where my parents added all of their research, and it's still written in sort of this narration style. But the people that they met, the
Mhm,
research, how they went to Laon, and so that's the second edition. And of course, if you want the whole story, it's better to read this version of the book.
mhm.
And it's been really really great to see that the book is also in bookstores but I guess mostly in France. But there's a few bookstores that really have it on the shelves, and that's really rewarding as well to know that in some of those places you can enter a bookstore and find
Mm,
Charles' book there. And it's easy. There's other sites, I think, where you can buy it online, but Amazon is, I guess,
okay.
the easiest way to find
Mm.
it.
I will link that, into this at the end, the sites. Is there anything else that is important about the book, Charles's words, or your family's experience in writing and publishing the book that you would like to share with us?
We are very proud that this book exists today. This text could have been lost forever, and instead it's now part of history. More than 3,000 people have read it, and we hope the book can continue to travel.
Yeah, I think that's the most important part is that, as I mentioned, we hope that the book can continue to find new readers, and continue to help people understand, and not just as this this war story that we see in movies and we see in books, but really this lived experience, this individual experience, but that also reflects a lot of other experience that are not being told. And I think it probably, unfortunately, there's still a lot of conflicts today in the world. So I guess a little of that, what's inside that book, can also help us understand what's going on today for a lot of people that are facing those difficult times. And we are very proud that Charles is officially recognized among World War One soldiers writers, and including in research institutions that are dedicated to soldiers from Alsace-Lorraine. So we hope we can continue to share his story, and we're really proud of everything that we've done so far, and we're really thankful to you as well for allowing us and to share his story, and for having us on your podcast. And it's been really great to discuss this book with you, because we can tell it really resonates with you as well. And so it's always a pleasure to discuss this book with people that really see the beauty in it.
Thank you both for being here, and thank you to your family for persevering. These projects often are labors of love in ways, and it takes continuous advocacy and determination and perseverance in order to get the message and the words and the narrative out so that people can read and understand this dimension of the war. And it's been wonderful to talk to both of you today and to have corresponded with you for a number of years. And hopefully the next time I'm in Paris, I'll be able to see you again. Thank you both so much. And I look forward to seeing the movie, to seeing the film when it finally reaches.
You'll be invited to the premiere.
Yes, I will be at the premiere. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very
Heather.
much. Thank you.